She looked at him with that smirk, the kind that said she had already made up her mind before he even walked through the door. The paperwork sat untouched on her desk. His credit score was excellent. His business plan was solid. His collateral was more than sufficient. But none of that mattered because Marcus Wellington was a black man asking for a loan in rural Georgia, and Sarah Mitchell had decided his fate the moment she saw him approach her desk at Riverside Community Bank. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 18 months later, Marcus would walk back through those same doors, but this time he wouldn't be asking for anything. This time he would own everything, and every single person who humiliated him that day would be clearing out their desks before sunset. Before we continue with what happened next, tell us where you're watching from. Are you from the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia? Which city? Drop it in the comments right now because this situation happens in communities everywhere, and we want to know where our viewers are standing up against discrimination. Marcus Wellington had been farming his family's land for 15 years. His grandfather bought those 200 acres back in 1967, one of the few black families in Riverside County who managed to hold onto their property through decades of economic pressure and discrimination. Marcus grew up watching his grandfather work that soil, learning everything about sustainable farming, crop rotation, and land management. By 2019, Marcus had transformed that modest farm into something remarkable. He specialized in organic produce and had built relationships with restaurants and farmers markets throughout the region. His reputation for quality was impeccable. Chefs from Atlanta drove out to meet with him personally. His waiting list for CSA boxes stretched 6 months long. He employed 12 people from the local community, paying them fair wages with benefits, but Marcus had a vision that extended beyond his current operation. He wanted to expand. The adjacent property, another 150 acres, had come up for sale. The owner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson, had approached Marcus directly. She trusted him. She knew he would care for the land the way her late husband had. She gave him first option to purchase at a fair price, $375,000. Marcus had saved $100,000. He needed a $275,000 agricultural loan. With his track record, his credit score of 780, his existing collateral, and a detailed business plan showing how the expansion would increase his revenue by 60% within 2 years, it should have been straightforward. He chose Riverside Community Bank because they advertised themselves as supporters of local agriculture. Their billboards along Highway 19 proclaimed "Growing with our community," and "Your neighbor, your bank." Marcus had seen their president, Douglas Hartman, at Chamber of Commerce meetings, always talking about the bank's commitment to local businesses. On Tuesday morning, March 12, 2019, Marcus walked into Riverside Community Bank wearing his best suit, carrying a leather folder with his application materials, business plan, and financial statements. He had an appointment with Sarah Mitchell, the senior loan officer. He arrived 10 minutes early. The branch was quiet. A few customers conducted business at the teller windows. An elderly couple sat with someone in an office discussing what looked like retirement planning. Everything seemed professional and normal. Sarah Mitchell made him wait 35 minutes past his appointment time. He could see her at her desk, occasionally glancing toward the waiting area. But she finished a personal phone call, spent time organizing papers that didn't seem urgent, and chatted with a colleague about weekend plans. Marcus remained patient. He understood that banking procedures took time. Finally, she called him to her desk. She didn't stand to greet him. She didn't offer a handshake. She gestured to the chair across from her desk and said his name like a question, even though she had his appointment right there in her calendar. He presented his materials. She barely looked at them. She flipped through his business plan without reading it, spending perhaps 15 seconds per page on a document that represented months of work and professional consultation. His financial statements, meticulously prepared by a certified accountant, received the same dismissive treatment. Then she started asking questions, Not the normal questions about business projections or expansion plans. She asked if he actually owned his current property or if it was leased. Marcus explained that yes, the deed was in his name, inherited from his grandfather, free and clear. She asked if he had partners or investors who might pull out suddenly. He explained that he operated independently, which was clear from his financial statements if she had actually reviewed them. She asked how long he had actually been farming. He explained again patiently that he had 15 years of experience and the financial records to prove consistent profitability. She asked if he understood that farming was risky and unpredictable. Marcus, who had successfully navigated droughts, floods, market fluctuations, and supply chain challenges for a decade and a half, assured her that he understood agricultural risk management very well. Then she said it, the sentence that would change everything. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "Mr. Wellington, I'm just not sure someone like you is ready for this level of financial responsibility. Agricultural lending requires a certain type of experience and background." Someone like him, the phrase hung in the air. Marcus asked her to clarify what she meant by that. She backtracked slightly, claiming she meant someone without traditional agricultural education, even though his file showed he had a degree in agricultural business from the University of Georgia. She suggested that perhaps he should consider a smaller loan, maybe for equipment rather than land expansion. She mentioned programs for disadvantaged farmers that might be more appropriate. Marcus remained calm. He pointed out that his credit score exceeded their published requirements. His debt-to-income ratio was excellent. His collateral exceeded the loan amount. His business history demonstrated consistent profitability. He asked specifically which underwriting criteria his application failed to meet. Sarah became defensive. She said lending decisions involved multiple factors beyond what appeared on paper. She mentioned community standards and fit. She suggested that perhaps his expansion plans were too ambitious, that he might be getting ahead of himself. She recommended he gain a few more years of experience, even though 15 years already put him in the veteran farmer category. Another loan officer, Jason Reeves, had noticed the interaction. He approached and asked if there was a problem. Sarah explained that she was just trying to manage expectations for an unqualified applicant. Jason glanced at Marcus's materials and saw the credit score, the business history, the collateral. He pulled Sarah aside. Marcus could hear fragments of their conversation. Jason suggested that the application actually looked strong. Sarah insisted there were other factors to consider. Jason pointed out that they had approved loans with weaker profiles just last week. Sarah said those situations were different, that this was complicated, that Marcus didn't understand what he was getting into. Jason seemed uncomfortable, but didn't push further. The bank hierarchy was clear. Sarah had been there 12 years and had the authority to make these decisions. Jason had been there 3 years and knew better than to challenge her publicly. Sarah returned to her desk and delivered her decision. The bank would not be moving forward with his application at this time. She suggested he consider other options, perhaps through government assistance programs. She slid his materials across the desk without putting them back in any order. Marcus asked for the decision in writing, including the specific reasons for denial. Sarah said she would mail it to him. He asked when he could expect it. She said within 10 business days, which was longer than the legally required time frame, but he didn't challenge it in the moment. As Marcus stood to leave, he noticed the bank president, Douglas Hartman, had emerged from his office. He had clearly heard at least part of the exchange. Marcus made eye contact with him, expecting perhaps some intervention or at least acknowledgement. Douglas Hartman looked away and returned to his office, closing the door. Marcus walked out of Riverside Community Bank that morning, knowing exactly what had happened. This wasn't about his qualifications. This wasn't about risk assessment. This was about the color of his skin and the prejudices of people who had power over opportunities that should have been evaluated fairly. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes, processing the humiliation and anger. Then he made a decision. He wasn't going to complain. He wasn't going to file a discrimination lawsuit that would drag on for years and cost him everything. He was going to do something else entirely. He was going to win. Marcus went home and called Mrs. Patterson. He explained that the bank had denied his loan application and asked if she could extend his option period. She was frustrated to hear about the denial and immediately agreed to give him 6 more months. She trusted him and wanted him to have that land. Then Marcus started making calls. He contacted an agricultural investment fund based in Atlanta that specialized in supporting minority farmers. He connected with a network of private investors who focused on sustainable agriculture. He reached out to community development financial institutions that had missions aligned with addressing discrimination in lending. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had secured his financing through alternative sources. The terms were actually better than what the bank had offered. His interest rate was lower. His repayment schedule was more flexible, and the organizations he worked with understood his vision and supported his growth. He closed on the Patterson property in May 2019. He immediately began implementation of his expansion plan, exactly as outlined in the business proposal that Sarah Mitchell had barely glanced at. He installed new irrigation systems. He built additional greenhouse structures. He hired 8 more employees. He diversified his crop selection and added value-added products like preserved goods and specialty items. By harvest season that fall, his revenue had already increased 42%. His customer base expanded throughout Georgia and into neighboring states. A major grocery chain approached him about supplying their organic produce sections. A food magazine featured him in an article about the future of sustainable agriculture. But Marcus was doing something else, something nobody at Riverside Community Bank knew about. He was paying attention to them. He was watching their financial reports, which, as a publicly traded community bank, they had to file quarterly. And he was noticing something interesting. Riverside Community Bank was struggling. They had made a series of bad commercial real estate loans. Their consumer loan portfolio had higher default rates than regional averages. Their overhead costs were disproportionate to their revenue. Their stock price had declined 38% over the previous 18 months. They were vulnerable. Marcus began purchasing small amounts of their stock. Not enough to trigger disclosure requirements, but enough to start building a position. He connected with other investors who had concerns about the bank's leadership and performance. He attended shareholder meetings as a small investor, listening and learning. In November 2019, Riverside Community Bank's largest shareholder, a regional investment fund that held 23% of outstanding shares, decided to exit their position. They were liquidating holdings in smaller community banks to focus on larger financial institutions. Marcus learned about this through his investment network. He moved quickly. He formed an investment group that included the agricultural investors who had funded his expansion, community leaders concerned about discriminatory lending practices, and financial professionals who saw an opportunity to transform a struggling institution. Together, they had the capital to acquire not just the 23% being sold, but additional shares being quietly offered by other frustrated investors. The transaction happened over 6 weeks. It was complex and involved multiple entities, but by January 2020, Marcus's investment group controlled 54% of Riverside Community Bank. They had majority ownership. They had control of the board. They had the power to make changes. Marcus didn't announce his ownership publicly at first. He spent 3 months conducting a comprehensive audit of the bank's operations, lending practices, and personnel. What he found confirmed everything he had suspected. Sarah Mitchell had a pattern. Over her 12 years at the bank, she had systematically denied or discouraged loan applications from Black applicants, Hispanic applicants, and other minorities at rates dramatically higher than their white counterparts with similar qualifications. She had violated fair lending laws repeatedly. She had cost the bank millions and lost business and exposed them to massive legal liability. Jason Reeves, the loan officer who had briefly questioned her decision, had gone along with dozens of similar situations. He knew what was happening and had said nothing. He had prioritized his job security over doing the right thing. Douglas Hartman, the bank president, had either ignored the pattern or actively enabled it. Under his leadership, the bank had developed a reputation in minority communities as a place that didn't welcome their business. Qualified applicants had stopped even trying. The bank's discrimination hadn't just been morally wrong, it had been financially devastating. The odd, it also revealed incompetence beyond the discrimination. Poor risk assessment had led to bad loans being approved while good ones were denied. Operational inefficiencies had created unnecessary costs. Customer service was poor, leading to steady account closures. The bank's problems ran deep. Marcus and his investment group made their decision. They would clean house. They would transform this institution into what it claimed to be, but had never actually become: a true community bank that served all community members fairly. On April 15, 2020, Marcus Wellington walked back through the doors of Riverside Community Bank. But this time, he arrived as the principal owner and newly appointed chairman of the board. He was accompanied by attorneys, human resources professionals, and the new executive team his group had recruited. Sarah Mitchell was at her desk. She glanced up at him with a flicker of recognition, but no real comprehension of what was happening. Jason Reeves was in his office. Douglas Hartman was in a meeting with commercial clients, still acting as president, still unaware that his employment had already been terminated as of that morning. Marcus walked directly to Sarah Mitchell's desk. She looked up, confused about why this farmer was back and why he was dressed in an expensive suit and accompanied by several serious-looking people. He identified himself formally. He informed her that as of that morning, he was the chairman of the board of Riverside Community Bank. He informed her that the bank was under new ownership and new management, and he informed her that her employment was terminated effective immediately for cause, including violations of fair lending laws and discriminatory practices. The color drained from her face. She started to speak, to protest, to deny. Marcus calmly provided her with documentation of 12 specific instances of discriminatory lending decisions, including his own application, each one meticulously documented during the audit. He handed her the termination paperwork and information about her final paycheck, which would include no severance due to the for-cause nature of her termination. Security personnel, hired specifically for this day, stood nearby. Sarah was given 30 minutes to collect her personal belongings under supervision. She was not permitted to access any bank files or systems. Her company computer, phone, and access credentials were immediately deactivated. Jason Reeves received the same treatment. His failure to report known discrimination and his participation in creating a hostile environment for minority applicants ended his career at the bank that morning. Douglas Hartman was called out of his meeting. In his own office, in front of witnesses, Marcus informed him that he was no longer president of Riverside Community Bank. His tenure had been marked by discriminatory practices, poor financial performance, and failures of leadership that had nearly destroyed the institution. He was terminated immediately. His employment contracts for Oz provisions meant no golden parachute, no extended severance, just the end. By noon that day, 7 employees had been terminated. All of them had participated in or enabled the discriminatory practices that had pervaded the bank's culture. All of them had received documentation of the specific reasons for their termination. All of them left the building that day knowing exactly why their careers had ended. Marcus gathered the remaining staff. He was honest with them. He explained what had happened, why ownership had changed, and what it meant. He acknowledged that they were probably scared about their jobs. He told them that employees who had done their jobs fairly and competently had nothing to fear. Employees who had participated in discrimination or knew about it and said nothing would be gone. The odd, it would determine who fell into which category. Then he explained the new vision. Riverside Community Bank would become a genuine community institution. Fair lending practices would be enforced rigorously. Diversity in hiring would be prioritized. Community investment would be real, not just marketing rhetoric. Training on fair lending and anti-discrimination would be mandatory for everyone. Performance would be measured not just by profit, but by how well the bank served all members of the community. He introduced the new leadership team. The new president was an experienced banking executive with a track record of building inclusive institutions. The new chief lending officer was a specialist in agricultural and small business lending who understood how to evaluate risk fairly. The new head of HR had expertise in building equitable workplace cultures. Over the following weeks, more changes came. Loan application processes were standardized to reduce opportunities for discriminatory decision-making. Mystery shopping programs were implemented to identify any remaining bias in customer service. Community outreach programs were launched to rebuild trust with minority residents who had been excluded. Financial education workshops were offered throughout the community. The bank reached out to every minority applicant who had been denied loans in the previous 5 years. Their applications were reviewed again under the new standards. Marcus himself was involved in this process, though he recused himself from any decisions about his own previous application. Of the 83 applications reviewed, 47 had been wrongly denied. Those applicants were contacted, apologized to, and offered the opportunity to reapply under fair consideration. Some of those wrongly denied applicants had given up on their dreams. Others had found alternative financing like Marcus had. Some were eager for another chance. The bank approved 21 loans for previously denied applicants within the first 6 months under new ownership. Those loans, evaluated properly, performed well. The default rate was actually lower than the bank's overall portfolio average. The bank's financial performance began to improve. Properly evaluated loans based on actual credit worthiness rather than the loan officer's prejudices created a healthier portfolio. Operational efficiencies reduced costs. New customers, attracted by the bank's genuine commitment to the community, opened accounts. Revenue increased quarter over quarter. Sarah Mitchell tried to find another position in banking, but Riverside Community Bank's documentation of her discriminatory practices followed her. Financial institutions, aware of the massive legal liability such behavior creates, were unwilling to hire someone with her track record. She eventually left the banking industry entirely. Her career, built on prejudice, ended exactly as it should have. Douglas Hartman attempted to claim wrongful termination, but the documentation was overwhelming. His lawsuit was dismissed. He took a position at a much smaller bank in another state, at a fraction of his previous salary. His reputation in the industry never recovered. Jason Reeves publicly claimed he had been just following orders, but the evidence showed he had independently made discriminatory decisions and had multiple opportunities to report problems he chose to ignore. He faced difficulty finding similar employment and eventually moved into a different industry. Marcus Wellington's farm continued to thrive. The expansion he had envisioned, the one Sarah Mitchell had deemed too ambitious for someone like him, exceeded every projection. By 2023, his operation employed 42 people, supplied produce to hundreds of outlets throughout the Southeast, and had become a model of sustainable agriculture. But perhaps more importantly, Riverside Community Bank became something different under his ownership. It became proof that community banks could serve entire communities fairly and still be profitable. It became an institution that other banks studied as an example of how to build inclusive practices. It became what it had always claimed to be, but had never been. The transformation wasn't just about Marcus getting revenge, though there was certainly an element of justice in watching the people who had discriminated against him lose everything they had built on foundations of prejudice. It was about changing a system that had denied opportunities to countless people based on nothing more than the color of their skin. In 2022, Marcus spoke at a banking industry conference about his experience. He told the story of being denied that loan, of the casual discrimination he had faced, of the decision he made to fight back, not through litigation, but through ownership. He challenged other banking leaders to examine their own institutions honestly, to look at their loan approval rates by race, to audit their decision-making processes for hidden bias. Some in the audience were defensive. Others were thoughtful. A few approached him afterward to ask for advice on conducting similar audits. Change in the banking industry is slow, but Marcus had proven that it was possible. The bank continued to grow. By 2024, it had opened 2 additional branches in nearby communities. All of its lending officers received ongoing training in fair lending practices. Its board of directors was diverse. Its loan portfolio reflected the actual demographics of the communities it served. It had become profitable while being principled. Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had sold Marcus the land that enabled his expansion, lived to see everything he accomplished. Before she passed away in 2023, she told him she had always known he was the right person for that land. She had trusted him when the bank wouldn't. Her faith had been rewarded beyond anything she could have imagined. The other 11 employees Marcus had hired before the expansion, the ones working his original 200 acres, stayed with him through everything. Several of them eventually became supervisors as the operation grew. He paid them well, offered benefits, and created a workplace built on respect. They told their friends and family about what had happened, about how their boss had been denied a loan and then bought the bank. The story spread through the community and beyond. Young farmers, particularly young black farmers, started reaching out to Marcus for advice. He became a mentor to dozens of people trying to build their own agricultural businesses. He shared what he had learned, connected them with resources, and yes, when they needed financing, he made sure Riverside Community Bank evaluated their applications fairly. The story of Marcus Wellington and Riverside Community Bank became more than just one man's response to discrimination. It became an example of what's possible when someone refuses to accept injustice, when they channel their anger into action, and when they have the vision to see beyond revenge to real transformation. Sarah Mitchell had looked at Marcus that day in March 2019 and seen someone she could dismiss, someone whose dreams she could crush with a few prejudiced decisions. She had been so certain of her power, so comfortable in her discrimination, so convinced that people like Marcus would never be able to challenge people like her. She had been catastrophically wrong. The man she had judged as unworthy of a loan had become her boss long enough to fire her. The applicant she had dismissed had gained the power to end her career. The farmer she had underestimated had outmaneuvered, outthought, and outperformed everyone who had stood in his way. But Marcus didn't stop at revenge. He could have simply fired everyone who had wronged him and walked away. Instead, he built something better. He took a broken, discriminatory institution and transformed it into something that actually served its community. He proved that doing the right thing and being successful in business aren't contradictory goals. Today, if you walk into Riverside Community Bank, you'll see something different than what existed before 2020. You'll see diversity in the staff. You'll see loan officers who evaluate applications based on facts and qualifications. You'll see community investment that's real. You'll see an institution that understands it exists to serve people, all people. And if you ask about the chairman of the board, they'll tell you about Marcus Wellington. They'll tell you about a farmer who was denied a loan he qualified for, who refused to accept that injustice, and who came back to own the place. They'll tell you about someone who turned discrimination into transformation. His story spread beyond banking circles. Media outlets covered it. Business schools used it as a case study. Community organizers cited it as an example of economic empowerment. It became larger than one man's experience because it represented something universal, the power of perseverance, strategic thinking, and refusal to accept injustice. Marcus still farms. He still gets up early to walk his fields, to check on crops, to work with his hands in the soil his grandfather once tended. But he also serves as chairman of a bank that now does what it should have been doing all along. He lives in both worlds, agriculture and finance, and he's transformed both. The land that Sarah Mitchell didn't think he was ready for now produces crops that feed thousands. The bank that Douglas Hartman ran into the ground is now profitable and principled. The community that once had an institution that excluded many of its members now has a bank that genuinely serves everyone. When people ask Marcus if he ever gets satisfaction from what happened, from watching the people who discriminated against him lose everything, he gives a nuanced answer. Yes, there was satisfaction in justice being served. Yes, there was vindication in proving every one of their prejudiced assumptions wrong. But the real satisfaction came from building something better, from creating an institution that wouldn't treat the next Marcus Wellington the way he had been treated. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted change. And he achieved it. So now we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced discrimination when applying for a loan, a job, or any opportunity? Have you seen institutions that claim to serve everyone but actually exclude certain communities? Have you witnessed someone fight back against injustice and win? Share your stories in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, what city, what country. Tell us if this story resonates with your own experiences or with situations you've witnessed. Because every time we share these stories, every time we talk about discrimination and how to fight it, we make it harder for the Sarah Mitchells and Douglas Hartmans of the world to continue their practices unchallenged. Marcus Wellington turned his anger into ownership and his ownership into transformation. That's the model. That's how you fight systems that are designed to keep you out. You don't just break down the door, you buy the building and rebuild it the right way. And to anyone out there who has been told you're not ready, you're not qualified, you're not the right fit when you know that you are, remember this story. Remember that the people who underestimate you, who discriminate against you, who try to keep you out, they're making the biggest mistake of their lives. Because when you prove them wrong, and you will prove them wrong, the victory will be so much sweeter than they can possibly imagine. Marcus Wellington walked out of that bank in March 2019, humiliated and angry. He walked back in April 2020 as the owner, and he walked out that day having fired everyone who had wronged him. That's not just revenge. That's justice, that's transformation, that's how you change the world. Drop your comments below. Share this story. Let people know that discrimination has consequences, that underestimating people based on prejudice is a losing strategy, and that justice, real justice, is possible when people refuse to give up. Marcus Wellington's story is still being written. Riverside Community Bank continues to grow and serve. The people he fired are living with the consequences of their actions. And somewhere out there, another person is being discriminated against, being told they're not good enough, being denied an opportunity they deserve. Maybe they'll hear this story. Maybe they'll refuse to give up. Maybe they'll find their own path to victory. That's what we're hoping for. That's why stories like this matter. Because they prove that the system can be changed, that injustice can be overcome, and that the people who think they have all the power can lose everything to the people they underestimated. Remember Marcus Wellington's name. Remember what he did. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember that revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about building something better than what existed before. Now tell us what you think. Are you inspired? Are you angry? Are you ready to fight your own battles against discrimination? Let us know in the comments. Tell us your city, your story, your perspective. Because this conversation is just beginning, and we want to hear from all of you. Marcus Wellington didn't just win, he transformed, and that's the real lesson here. That's what makes this story more than just a satisfying tale of revenge. It's a blueprint for how to take injustice and turn it into lasting change. So what are you waiting for? Drop those comments, share this story, and remember that every person who has been underestimated, discriminated against, and told they're not enough has the potential to come back and own the whole operation. Just like Marcus Wellington did.